kind of wired in a way that I like working with other people to solve problems. I get really curious about weird strategic questions they have, and that's as true for tiny little breweries that I help starting up. There's one in Indiana right now I'm working with. It's 3 guys, and it's like they're kind of, it's going to be their second careers as a group, and I'm excited about them. It's very, very tiny, and then there's people as big as, Five Rabbit was one of our larger craft brewers now here in Chicago. And then even some of the big ones, I've done some design work for Pacifico, and that went really, really well. I really liked the culture that they had there. So from top to bottom, I really like solving these puzzles in the beer world because it's just kind of where my head goes all day.
How do you kind of deal with the kind of the cognitive dissonance, or is there any dissonance over the Pacifico and Five Rabbit, where, it's 2 great examples because Five Rabbit would love to cut into Pacifico, probably specifically the people in America, the Latino members of society who are drinking Pacifico. We want them to start realizing what craft beer is. We love craft beer, and we think they should be drinking our craft beer. And then you go to Pacifico, who's saying, no. We want to grow and bolster what we have.
Sure.
It would be very hard for me. What is it like for you?
Well, it's a hard example just because 70% of Pacifico is still sold in California. So it's not,
sure. Yeah.
And also the people who drink Pacifico are not Latinos. They're white surfers who go down to Baja.
Okay.
And so everybody, I don't know. But the question you're asking is when they're essentially competing. And that would be true of any brewer within this area, who sells beer in Chicago. If I'm helping somebody in Chicago, my goal as a strategist is to help people find their own slice of the pie that they can own. Nobody's ever really asked me to go after somebody else's slice of the pie. It'd be an interesting moment, I remember when Tony McGee got really upset on Twitter about the Sam Adams crew saying they were going after Lagunitas IPA handles. He got really upset about that. He felt like that was his territory and they were targeting him unfairly. To me, that's sort of like a hey buddy, grow up kind of scenario.
Sure, if they're not saying it openly, you're not telling
know
me
that's
that
happening.
Some guy at some level of management is saying, I want to see XYZ converted to ABC.
So my goal as a brand and portfolio strategist is to set people up in a direction that they can go own. They still have to do the work of selling that beer, pushing that beer every day, creating pull in the market. My goal is to set them up in the best possible position to do that in a way that they can personally defend. This is who we are, this is the kind of beer we make, and this is how we talk about it. I would have to work with hundreds of breweries, I think, before I would find a real overlap between 2 people in the same market trying to do the same thing. Right now it's going to grow, and we're talking about smaller and smaller slices of the pie. From a brand perspective, it's easier to have a lot of overlap. You can have multiple people working in the same place, and they actually help each other perform in some ways.
What do you mean by that?
So, I was talking to Ron Extract from Jester King once, and he told me that he had a lot of guest taps on down at the brewery in Austin. I was like, well, what kind of guest taps? And everything he named off sounded like a beer that Jester King would make. I was like, why the hell would you bring in, Off Color? Why would you bring in Jolly Pumpkin and serve them alongside your beers in your brewery when you're making those kinds of beers? He's like, because down here I don't want people to think we're just some weird off-the-wall brewery that's just kind of this niche and we're kind of squirrely and we don't get what's going on in beer. I want people to realize that we're part of a movement. We're part of this collection of brewers that thinks this way, and I would love for them to circle around through those portfolios and come back to mine. So he was in a position where he was still trying to grow a bigger piece of a small pie.
Yeah.
And I think that's
what a great insight too. That's so
absolutely.
That's awesome.
There's competition and there's alignment. And so anytime I make these charts whenever I'm doing a competitive analysis for one of my brewing partners. I show them who they're similar to and who they're different than. And if we like who we're similar to, cool. Sounds like we're already in kind of a good place. But if we don't like the people that we would be associated with, well, now it's time to start differentiating yourself. You don't want to be like them. We're going to get associated poorly. You want to go associate yourself with somebody else that's doing something in the vein of what you're doing that would get other people excited about you, that where you would find camaraderie, friendly competition, right? But where there's still a small piece of a niche pie that we're trying to grow. And I think that's what's happening when we were out at Shelton Fest. That's what we saw. Every brewery in that room felt like they were part of a farmhouse kind of movement. We're all making funky, rustic, saison, farmhouse, not all of them, but a lot of them, sours. That is a very small piece of a bigger pie, and they want that to grow. And in order to do that, they need everybody to be producing at the top of their game, having their own unique spin on things. So I guess there's probably a long time before we're in a position where everybody's trying to do the same exact thing. I don't think that'll ever really happen in beer, but it'll get tighter. It's going to get tighter.
Okay.
But the Five Rabbit and Pacifico example is, the other way I would look at that is that there's always a top and a bottom to a market. And everybody sort of, if everybody was gunning for the middle, it'd be a problem. But Pacifico's not trying to be, they're not trying to be high-end craft. They're still trying to be a brand that you pick up, in a 12-pack. And meanwhile, Five Rabbit is trying to stand out as, an artisanal kind of craft brewer here in Chicago that's making very Latino-inspired exotic ingredient kind of beers. Fundamentally, two different markets. Now, each one of them is going to have a high and a low, even in their portfolio. Super Pills, Magnifico Wheat, that's probably more competitive with Pacifico than anything else in their portfolio, which would be night and day. But yeah, my job is to help everybody find a home and then help them defend that home as much as possible.
So let me ask you, not necessarily as what you do, but just as someone who has a lot of perspective of different aspects of the craft market, different segments of the craft market. Do you think that there are people, do you think that there are breweries on the, let's say like AB InBev, Miller Coors, the evil people, as the people who, not evil, the people who get villainized, and I say evil this way. The people
I think villainized is a fair word.
Yeah. Do you think they see room in this space for everyone, or do they want it to, or are they saying we want it back like it was in the good old days in 1980 when we ran the show and I just had to worry about Joey Miller over there and Freddie Coors?
When you're a company of that size, regardless of what industry you're in, the simplicity of the market favors you. When markets get complex and diversified, you start losing. Just from a market perspective, of course they want that to go back to the way the 80s were. It would simplify their business model, be easier for them to make money, they would have more weight to throw around in the industry. And they're going to do whatever, any business of that size would do the same thing. You see it at that level. I think you see it regionally as well, with even some large craft brewers starting to throw their weight around. They get involved in legislation that helps them and not others. Anytime you grow, you start to defend territory because the bigger you get, the more vulnerable you are. And your goal, the bigger you get, is to be more defendable. And those two things are kind of at odds with each other.
So for someone who loves, we're going to call it craft beer, what do you think the average consumer can do to help promote and strengthen that market segment, we'll call it?
Yeah, consumers are in a tricky spot right now because even if you throw your dollar at a shitty local brewery, if it's craft and local, it seems like you're helping fight against the big guys, if that's your goal. The truth is you're delaying the inevitable in some ways. And I don't mean the inevitable being somebody like AB takes over. I mean the inevitable of small craft producers disappearing because they're not doing a good enough job. And that's not just the beer, it's also the way they market themselves, the way they defend their territory, the way they sell beer. Right now, if you don't have people in the street selling your beer, like hand to hand, face to face in a bar, good luck getting a handle. It's getting competitive out there, and there's no AB handles to steal anymore. But as they buy craft producers, suddenly, there's a Goose Island handle, there's a 10-barrel handle, there's a Blue Point handle, there's a Leinenkugel's handle, AC Golden, those start to become targets. But I would say that small producers, when they're going in, somebody here local, a nano producer who wants a tap handle, and you're making an IPA, the only tap handle you can go, the one that should be in your line of sight is Lagunitas IPA. That's why it was ridiculous to me that he was upset about somebody competing against him, because of course, you're the IPA handle that's everywhere. That's the new Budweiser to a small producer. That's the one they need to get their handle on, to get velocity in their beers. So everybody's competing at a different level, and that means you're competing with somebody different. And so if you're a consumer, I think you have to vote for the best beer possible made by the best people you know. And that's always been a 1-2 punch for me. Always, I mean, I like to reward great beer no matter who it comes from, and I think that's fundamental. That's probably how I shuffle my deck of cards.
Yeah.
And that's true if it's from AB or a Belgian import or German import or somebody down the street. I always support the best beer I possibly can, because you only get to drink so many beers in your life.
True. But getting back to delaying the inevitable, I mean, let's go back to the beginning of some of these successful, we'll talk about Chicago breweries. Half Acre, and not to call people out, but I'm going to call them out in a positive way.
Yeah.
Half Acre and Metropolitan, I think, are producing really great stuff right now. They launched in the Chicago market about the same time.
Yeah.
And at the time, they were not putting out the
not
quality nearly as what we're seeing now.
Yeah, it's going to be harder to do that again.
Right.
Yeah, nearly impossible in some markets. I mean, if you're in San Diego, good fucking luck.
Right.
Yeah.
So, are you delaying it, or are you
Giving them a chance
to kind of?
Yeah, I
know what I'm saying?
I can get down with that argument for sure.
Yeah.
And I've definitely tossed my money towards a tiny brewery that wasn't on point yet, and that's okay. That's my personal decision. But I think in terms of if you're really interested in furthering craft beer right now, I guess your money is best placed on somebody like a Half Acre who's about to go through a multi-million-dollar expansion, because we need those guys out there holding down the market. They're going to be our defenders. They become the infrastructure for all those tiny brands, because they're out there beating the street, winning shelf space, getting handles in places where you can't get handles, like sports bars, BW3s. You can walk into a BW3 right now and get your choice of great craft beers, served reasonably well. That's huge. If we lose those kind of footholds, then craft beer is in trouble. If we can maintain those, we're never going away. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's kind of critical to this next way. So I guess to answer your question very directly, a consumer dollar is probably best used given to a solid, expanding brewery right now. Mm-hmm. Like, support the guys who are betting big on the future.
Taking into account the current climate of the market and where we see things going, because
we don't need more nanos.
We don't.
I'm always happy to see them, but we don't need them from an industry perspective.
No, we don't.
We need more Half Acres who are going through major growth phases.
At least not
Lagunitas who are going through major growth phases. Yeah.
Not in Chicago. There's some smaller markets.
Man, so I'm going home to New York State, tiny Pennsylvania, New York border where I grew up for Christmas to see my mom. I haven't been home in like 5 years. I asked Hillary, it seems like I'm always asking my wife to search for new breweries. I asked her, I was like, hey, can you see if there's any new breweries around there? I wonder if anybody's opened up a tiny little thing. 17 breweries within like a 15-mile radius in the middle of nowhere in the Twin Tiers of New York and Pennsylvania.
I'm not shaking my head because no. I'm shaking my head because it's unbelievable.
You know, a decent number of those guys are going to flame out pretty quickly, I'm sure, because there's not that much of a market, but a decent number will survive, and that's never been there before.
Yeah.
And it will never go away.
Yeah.
Because it's the barrier. Not completely. The barrier to entry to start up a tiny little nano brewery, even if it's just a pro hobby, will never go away again. Mm-hmm. You will have to change laws to shut those kind of people down.
Sure.
Because they will just keep entering the market.
Prohibition happens, so you never know. But
that's what makes me hopeful, and I guess it makes me it feels less like an evil empire situation, because I feel like we've taken enough territory that it will never go away. It'll never completely disappear again. We will always have, these shelves behind us, this is your local section, which has tripled since you opened.
Yeah.
It's just going to keep going for a while. Maybe it slows down and plateaus at some point, but what a plateau.
It's certainly not plateauing.
We don't need more than this. I don't need more options, but I'm excited to have them.
Sure. Yeah, you certainly don't need more options than that. But, as the market grows, then maybe all these guys can carve out their own little bit if they want to. Or if
some of them are going to band together, some of them will carve out their own niche and defend it, and then some of them will compete very directly, and they're all going to have a different approach.
And it's all
because it all means something different to them.
Right.
Owning a craft brewery is not the same thing to everybody. And that's what I think consumers really need to realize the most, is that the guy who makes beer in this brewery is very, very different than the guy making beer in this brewery.
It's not homogenous in any way.
Nope.
Why they're doing it, the size of it.
Their goals as a business.
Yeah.
Some of them would be excited to be in Anheuser-Busch's shoes right now.
Right.
And excited to be a part of their growing craft portfolio.
Right.
And some of them are going to be starting breweries with the intent of hoping to sell to somebody else, or taking on private equity, or just growing that thing like gangbusters. Other people are doing it because they want to do that for a job instead of work at Starbucks.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the stratification that exists in craft beer right now. That's why I think it's ridiculous to talk about it as, craft brewers as one type of thing. They're so fundamentally different from each other across the board.
That's kind of what I was
And I guess I geek
getting
out
at.
on the diversification of the business model, of the personalities, of the goals of the beer. There's so much diversification in this industry for me.
There absolutely is, and I think it does shine through, and I think that is the second part of what you said, a well-made beer by people that you can get behind and can love. And I think that's what I was referring to, or kind of alluding to earlier, when I'm saying people almost want these superheroes, these larger-than-life stories, if not people, behind the brewers. I do it all the time. I mean, I romanticize about some of these breweries, and just because I don't know why, it's a very human thing. I think you
so.
said.
I mean, we get excited about athletes.
Yeah.
What are they doing that's so meaningful compared to a brewer in some ways? It reminds me of the Peyton Manning commercials where he's high-fiving accountants on the way out of their jobs.
Right.
Like, I mean, that's a humorous way to look at it, but in our world, specific brewers who are doing specific things are really important to us. Not only
We call them rock stars. I mean, we literally call them, he's a rock star.
Yep.
Can we go to the next one?
Yeah, and this is a perfect example of, I'll call myself a fanboy of this guy. He's also a very close personal friend at this point, but Ryan Burke, who's, for my money, one of the best cider makers in the world right now.
So the beer we're drinking, or the cider we're drinking, rather.
Yeah, La Panette from Virtue Cider. Started by Greg Hall after the AV buyout of Goose Island. He went up to Fenville, Michigan, started a cidery. I think his first hire, if not one of his first hires, was Ryan Burke, who became his cider maker very quickly. Ryan grew up in New York State, where the way he tells it, it just sounds like this crazy town of like 16-year-olds running around grabbing spoiling apples on the side of the road and making booze out of them.
Oh, really?
So his cider making goes back pretty far, actually. And he found himself being the cider maker at Virtue Cider, and for all intents and purposes, he's the guy who has invented these recipes. In my mind, he is Virtue Cider. I mean, he's the guy out there every day making cider. He decided to go almost all natural fermentation with that cidery, which was not part of the original intent. It was just something he was fascinated in. He was getting great results, and they just kept letting him do it. Stephen and Greg, the sort of co-founders of Virtue, had the wherewithal and the vision, I think, to push Ryan into that role. It was a little bit of a sink or swim kind of role for him. I mean, Ryan had never done anything on this level, brewing or cider making.
Yeah, what was he doing before Virtue?
Man, he was part of a lot of homebrew competitions here in Chicago.
Okay.
Greg put him through Siebel to some extent. I'm not sure how far that went. And he learned a lot from Greg in the very beginning around what cider was, because Greg was very inspired by cider after his European trips. And then, before you knew it, they were just building the cidery up in Fenville, Michigan. And now if you go there, it's Ryan running that place. Greg and Steven are rarely there. They're out, raising money. They're building the brand. They're doing sales and events. And Greg is very much a face of that company, and that's his role as a founder. Ryan is the one back there inventing the next cider. He's barrel aging things. He's blending things. He's tasting things. He's running that fermentation cellar. And he's become a really close personal friend of mine. He came to my that camp I do, Camp Wandawega, the Good Beer Buckshot Getaway I do every year for friends and collaborators and industry folks. We kind of go get wild out in the woods of Wisconsin. Ryan came to the very first one. He was a friend of a friend, and that's when I really got to know him, and I got to taste his ciders for the first time. And that's when I realized that I didn't know anything about cider. That kind of blew me away. So the reason why I wanted to finish with this one, not only because it represents what has become sort of the personal side of this industry for me, which is getting to know people like Ryan in a deep way and being able to really call them friends and spend time with them at holidays. I mean, he's been at the studio every day this week just hanging out with me because he's in town. We just get to taste through things and talk about things and catch up. But for me, it was also drinking his cider was the same kind of aha moment I had when I drank Saison de Pont the first time.
Okay.
And it was, holy shit, this is what a great cider tastes like. I didn't know there were great ciders. Because for me, it's like these kind of ciders that are natural fermentation. There's a lot of wild yeast things going on in there. There's a lot of blending happening. He's blending for acid and tannins and things like that. I mean, it puts it right in lambics and gooses for me in terms of where my palate's gone. It Saison, like it just has that quality. So for me, it's almost like there's like wine, beer, and cider. and then there's this level at the top that spans across all of them that is just purely flavor and process driven.
Yeah,
Stuff that
absolutely.
is just, the flavors are so sophisticated, like you almost can't tell at some point what's what. Like it's very, shades of gray.
Sure, absolutely.
And that was, I guess that represents to me kind of next level. It's next level thinking for me. It's next level experience for me to even think about these products that way. To care about cider the way that I care about beer is a surprise to me, and I'm really excited. And people ask me sometimes, like, why do you write about cider? I'm like, oh yeah, I've written about Virtue. They're like, well, why not other ciders? It's like, well, it's been really hard to find stuff like Virtue in the United States that's produced in that way at that level that I care about. There's some. Farnham Hill is an amazing cider out of the Northeast, and I find most of them are in the Northeast, the ones that I really like.
Because they're older.
They're older. They're using heirloom apples. They're using cider apples, not food apples. They're not using Macintoshes and Granny Smiths and things like that.
Which, nothing, at some point, you gotta work with what you're given. You can't grow a tree overnight.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. And Virtue hasn't grown those trees overnight.
Exactly.
They're sourcing those apples from Michigan as much as they can. And then, like everybody, I think it was 2 years ago when there was just like the crop in Michigan was horrible. They got them all from Washington.
Yeah.
But yeah, they work with farmers, and I think that's really interesting. We always talk about this thing. There's this thing in beer now where we talk about beer with terroir, which I think is interesting concept, but ultimately kind of a joke of an idea with beer because the ingredients come from all over the world, and then you make them in a kettle in Michigan somewhere. That's different than Ryan, who thinks about weather in his region because he knows it's going to affect what he makes next year. Because those apples will or won't grow. Exactly. And other people are competing for the same apples on the same orchard sometimes. They get a call from a farmer who's like, I've got this many trees, and he knows he's got to either make a decision to go get them or let the next guy get them because that phone tree's going to have
one thing that is very easy to forget about cider is that every drop going into this glass came directly from an apple.
Yeah.
There was no turning on the spigot to just have it.
Yep.
Fill up your mash tun.
Yeah.
This was everything in here was squeezed out of an apple that was picked out of a tree.
Yeah.
So that tree, took the water up, and it's such. Beer is an agricultural product, but it's been so industrialized, and it's just so uniform.
Yeah.
And that the sources are so homogenized at this point that it really is borderline agricultural. It is by definition, but
depending on the producer, it's going to be more or less.
Sure.
Yeah.
But this is much more directly.
What's in our glass is this is a pure agrarian. It's him with an apple press and some tanks and some barrels.
Yeah.
Living next to farmers who are growing apples. And that's the ecosystem.
Right.
That's what
I can already see where
he's not even
going
pitching
next.
yeast.
You're going to wine next, I can tell, because I can just see.
I'm supposed to stop by Perman Wines down in the West Loop this week to pick up some stuff for home. But it's tough because it's hard for me to drink wine at this point because my palate is so specific.
See, I'm a wine guy who kind of went to beer.
Oh man, yeah, the opposite. But I think what consumers need to realize is that to think about cider in this singular way, we think of hard American apple cider as if that's all there is. But most of what you get, those hard American apple ciders, that's kind of like the amber ale of beer. It's the amber ale of cider. It's the basic stuff that everybody can make with the same basic recipe, same basic malt bill and hop profiles. But when you get into natural fermentation, you're not even pitching yeast into this thing.
Sure.
You're in a very different territory. You get funk, you get acid. Tannins are really strong in this. The aromas are great and complex. This is as good as any European saison to me. And that's, I think, to me, that's sort of the future of good beer hunting, is really investigating the cultivation of these kinds of products. And I guess that's the last series of articles that I started was called The Cultivated Beer. That's when I started visiting hop farms. I'm supposed to be going to Minneapolis in the spring to visit a maltster up there.
Yeah.
Digging into the water profiles and where we get water from and how that affects beer. The fruit, we just published an article about a fruit farm up in Michigan and how that, that's relationship with brewers. To me, that's where craft beer is going to compete in a way that it's not that big beer can't do it, but it'll be a lot harder, is working with these really good connected relationships that actually matter to the end product. You're not just a local business, you're a local producer working with other local producers to help each other grow.
And that is uncharted territory. Not that nobody has done it. Nobody knows if it truly does matter because it's been forgotten by time when everyone was malting and growing their own barley.
Right.
Nobody knows if it's going to matter.
Yeah. And I think the question for me is how far do you need to go for it to matter?
Right.
Because I think when it comes to Ryan ciders, to me it absolutely makes a fundamental difference in what I do.
Absolutely.
In
no
beer,
question
I think
there. I'm talking about beer.
Yeah, in beer it's going to be different, but we already see it in terms of who's got the hop contracts. It's kind of that's the beginning of that kind of relationship. Is if you have a relationship with hop farmers, you have a strategic advantage in this market.
Oh, absolutely.
And you also have a unique profile in your beer potentially. The
But I don't
Sierra
think-
Nevada just came out with the Neo Mexicalis, the wild hop ale. Has a really interesting, unique hop profile. Now maybe that's a one-off, so maybe that isn't. But to me, that's indicative of the relationships that brewers are starting to form as they get bigger because they can.
Yeah.
And they also need to guard that strategic advantage. Lagunitas
Exactly.
does the same thing with hop farmers.
I mean, and having a relationship with one of the mega farms in the Pacific Northwest is not exactly the same as going to Klug Farms and getting your pig.
No, not at all.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm talking about.
But now we're at the point where
when a
McClug-
guy in Chicago says, I'm moving out to the burbs and starting to grow barley, like, I met a guy from Seattle who came in here who said, I am starting a craft maltster.
Right.
And I'm going to get locally sourced grain and I'm going to malt it.
Yep.
That is, I mean, I want to see what that does because it's been so, it's like produce nowadays. I mean, produce has been so homogenized that nobody knows what a watermelon tasted like 500 years ago.
Yeah.
Or if it even existed at that point.
But I mean, what you're pondering is like, you're essentially asking, will the mainstream ever care? Because that's when it really starts to get
what
down
we're
to
doing
dollars
is sitting
and
at a
cents.
bar and having beers right now at this point. It's like we've gone off the rails.
But if there are stratifications in every market. And in craft beer, I think we're going to get to the point where we have a consumer where that will matter, and it'll be worth doing because there's going to be enough money there to make it worthwhile producing. And that's why we got into this argument before around pricing in beer. Because I was really excited about there starting to be a wider range in the top tier of beer prices. Not because I want people to pay more for beer, it's because I want beer to be allowed to be a certain price in order to make it okay to produce it.
Sure. But coming
that's gonna support people like Beguile, a local small brewer here, getting hops from Michigan and Wisconsin instead of just on the open market. They're gonna grow strategic relationships because of that, and if we're willing to pay $10 a bomber, it makes it possible.
Exactly. I mean, it just they have to be able to operate on that scale if they're going to stay at a certain level. Which right now, I mean, that is not really what many people want to do. They want to use that and then make a leap to kind of higher end production is what seems to be the stepping stone now. But what I was thinking about coming full circle is at the end of the day, it does matter what's in the glass to some extent too, because if it's blind tasting and everything's free and it doesn't taste any better, then nobody's going to care. There has any better to somebody.
But I'll raise you a spotted cow.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, that's green bush just blown up. Well, thank you very much. This has been awesome. It's been a lot of fun. Believe it or not, this is just how this guy talks all the time.
A pot calling kettle black there.
Yeah, right? No, this is us. And thank you guys, as always, for watching. It's been a blast just to have you guys with us as we're talking, and that's really how I kind of consider it. Michael, thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Thanks for letting me kind of share my journey through 4 beers. That was kind of cool.
Yeah.
You just gave me the run of the story. You said drink whatever you want.
Yeah, and it was kind of fun to see how you kind of crafted a little story.
I can't. I mean,
I wish I could have taken some photos.
It's
and
what we do, I guess.
White, all artsy fartsy, and
ironically, black and white is usually when I get a terrible photo. That's the least artsy of all of them.
Okay. Just shows how much
I'll
I
take
know. Guys, as always, feel free to leave comments. Check out Good Beer Hunting. What's the URL? GoodBeerHunting.com, right?
Yeah. Did you say Earl? Is that a thing?
Yeah, what's the URL?
That's a URL?
URL. I come from a tech background where it was
mountain
probably like
somewhere
the
in Virginia?
the lamest thing to say. Anyway.
Goodbeerhunting.com. Yeah.
Goodbeerhunting.com, and listen to the podcast. You can get it on iTunes or wherever.
Or it's right on the site as well.
Yeah. So guys, we've got some great beer to drink, and it seems like no matter where you are, even if you're in rural New York, sounds like you do too. So cheers, guys. Thanks a lot.